overview of the things that you might expect in terms of laboratory automation. Okay, so let me just highlight first the stuff that we're going to talk about. Adrian, is our presentation present? Is the presentation okay on YouTube?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so everything can be seen there. I'm not sure if it's visible there. So I apologize for typing it on Word, but what can we do? All right, so in the hematology department, we use several principles when we do automated analysis. One of those is what you call the electronic impedance, or electrical impedance rather. It's not electronic, it's electrical, sorry. Electrical impedance principle. So what happens from the word, it's from the name itself, you are trying to impede the electrical signals between one probe and between two probes. So it's like two probes, and then cells pass through those probes, and or an electrical field between two probes or electrodes, and they are suspended in a diluent material. So every time you're talking about a diluent material, this is something, it has something to do wherein the cells are allowed to move or pass through. Okay, so please be mindful that the Coulter principle is also known as the electrical impedance principle. What do I mean? Why do we call it the Coulter principle? It's because it was developed by somebody a guy named Coulter, right? Now, how do they measure? How does it measure cell counts? Well, the measurement of cell counts. Let me just put this in underline. The measurement of cell counts are measured by the number of interruptions, so pulses. So basically, the number of interruptions in the electrical signal. Okay, for example, you have RBCs flowing through an electrical field, and the number of RBCs are there. For example, 100 of them interrupted the signals. Okay, meaning that there is 100 RBCs. Very easy at a given time. So it will measure specific number of RBCs or number of cells at a given time, and then after that it closes off or it shuts off the electrical field. Okay, so that's how it measures cell counts, the number of interruptions. How it measures the cell size is the amount of resistance a cell creates as it passes through the electrical field. So the larger the cell, the more electrical resistance it produces, okay, or it impedes. Hence the term impedance. The measurement of the electrical resistance a single cell passing through creates, okay, the resistance. Okay, now since we're talking about automation, we have to consider several things. There's what you call a 3-part and a 5-part differential. A 3-part differential measures RBCs, WBCs, and platelets. You might hear this several times, especially when you're in the practice, and maybe the Gagaso clinics or the Gagaso diagnostic centers are going to open, right? And they want to have they want to interview manufacturers on how they develop or what type of features a specific machine has. So the presenter or the product specialist probably go and sit down in front of you and they say, "All right, Miss Gagaso, this is our machine. It's a 3-part differential machine, blah blah blah." So you gotta know what the hell that guy is talking about. So one way for you to know that is to understand what a 3-part and a 5-part differential is. All right. So a 5-part differential is basically the same thing, but with the addition of granulocytes, monocytes, and lymphocytes. It measures those things. Okay. Now, how does it measure the cellularity? Okay, how does it measure the cell count? For electrical impedance, it measures the number of interruptions. For cell size, the resistance created by a single cell passing through the electrical field. Okay? Now, let's talk about the factors affecting this principle. The size of the apertures are important. What is the apertures? These are the openings. So if you are familiar with photography, there's what you call an aperture on the lens. Similar to that, every machine or every analyzer has some sort of aperture where the cells pass through. And inside the aperture, and that aperture should be small enough to allow the passage of one cell only. Okay, that's why it's difficult to manufacture a machine that can do measurements for cells. It needs to have an aperture small enough for cells to pass in a single line. Otherwise, you might be having double readings. Okay? We'll talk about double readings later. Another thing that you need to take into consideration is build up. If you're using a machine that utilizes or analyzes blood samples, it's going to have a lot of proteins. Okay? When there's a lot of proteins building up in the sample or building up in the tubings, you gotta clean it. And that's part of the daily maintenance protocols. Okay? So you need to be mindful of this one. Protein buildup doesn't necessarily interfere with the counting. It can interfere also with the amount of electrical waves or the electrical field being produced by the electrodes, between the two electrodes rather. Alright? Carryover is something that you need to be mindful of. Carryover is defined as the contamination of the aperture by the previous specimen being analyzed. So for example, I'm running specimen 1, and specimen 1 has a lot of platelets. Specimen 2 is a patient with thrombocythemia, thrombocytopenia. The physician might consider it, why did my patient have normal platelets? I'm expecting and they just collected the blood sample in the morning, and then they realized based on doing delta checking, why did my patient have a normal platelet result? I was assuming that this patient would have an increase in his platelets, but not that much in a couple of hours. Parang ganon. Alright? So carryover can result to contamination. So overall, it's related to contamination. Okay, so you gotta have a machine that needs to self clean itself. All right, so it has to avoid protein buildup, and it has to avoid carryover. Another thing that I need to mention is coincidence counting. Two cells passing through one aperture at the same time. All right. So, two cells passing through one aperture at the same time. It's very vague, sir. Medyo hindi ko naintindihan. You remember what I told you about the definition of an aperture, right? It has to be small enough to allow the passage of single cells. Now, coincidence counting, there's two cells passing through. Okay? And they're being read as one. So what do you mean? How do we avoid this? Well, first of all, we gotta check the patient's condition. There are some cases where microcytosis occurs, like extreme microcytosis, or giant platelets can be counted as WBCs or as RBCs. Okay, so be mindful of these things because this can result to an anomalous histogram. All right. Speaking of histogram, we're going to talk about that later. Develop dapat, mali ang grammar ni sir. Alright, another thing that we need to take into consideration is what they call burn circuits. Burn circuits are developed by machine manufacturers to remove protein buildup. So that's one way for the machine to maintain itself in its prime performance. Okay? Now, presentations of data. Okay, presentations from data is presented in a scatter plot or a histogram. Histogram, may makikita ninyo yung may mga graph. Okay, we're going to discuss that probably next week if we have time. But this is in a form of a chart. So it's plots. Bakit kailangan nating malaman ang mga histogram? Kasi it is a summary of a patient's sample result. I'll show you guys an example of a result later on when we discuss anemias. Okay, but for now, you just need to know that histograms are important primarily because they are the these are the data, or this is a data that is presented in the form of a chart. Now it usually separates the population based on volume distribution thresholds. So what do I mean by volume distribution thresholds? So a cell can be counted by the machine. So the cell doesn't necessarily know what the cell is passing what cell is passing through. It bases it on the size definition, on the size and the granularity of the cell. So for example, in electrical impedance, a cell is counted based on the number of interruptions. How does it know that? How does the cell know it's? How does the machine know whether it's a WBC or an RBC? Well, first of all, an analyzer needs to lyse the RBCs first. Okay, needs to lyse the RBCs, and therefore it's going to only platelets and WBCs. That's the time sizing is important, right? Some cells they have a lot of granules, and therefore they would produce a higher resistance. Some cells are agranular or have slight granule formations, and therefore, so for example, lymphocytes, their size is smaller, as well as the granule resistance, or the resistance from the lack of the granules is different, and they're going to plot it differently also by the in the histogram. Okay? Another thing that you need to take into consideration is radiofrequency. Radiofrequency is another principle similar to Coulter principle, but it measures the electromagnetic waves or the electromagnetic current flowing through electrodes. So similar to that, it's similar. It's a similar process, but it measures the cell size using RF signal or radio frequency signals. The larger the cell, the higher the height of the pulse created by the cell. Okay, so it measures it by pulse. So electromagnetic current is flowing this time. It has something to do with electromagnetic currents. All right. Now DC signal is the direct current, has something to do with electricity. Okay, that's how it can determine the cell type. Okay, the conductivity of the cell correlates to the amount of nuclear material and cytoplasmic granulation. And this time the data is presented in a scatter plot. Okay, histograms are good when you want to look at the cells. When you want to look at the cell size average. Scatter plots are important when you want to know the distribution of the cells in a particular sample. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. Now, the next thing that you need to remember is optical scatter. Optical scatter is known also as flow cytometry. Flow cytometry is based on the amount of of the light being directed to cells. It measures the cell. Measurements are made by lasers as cells pass through a fluid media. What is the fluid media again? It's called as a diluent. This time the diluent is not conductive. It allows only the flow of the cells and allows cellular integrity to remain intact. Okay? The light scatter determines the cellular characteristics, and the sensors will identify the cell as it passes through the flow cell. They call it a flow cell or a throw. Okay? Now, there are two types of light scatter in flow cytometry. The lasers can point it forward at 90 degrees. Okay? This is known as, it can point it forward at 180 degrees. 90 degrees pala is different. So it points it directly to the cell, and there's laser detectors. So for example, the cell is here, the laser is here, and the cell passes through, the cell is Saan ba magandang position? It's in front, and then it will exit downward. Okay? So as the cell passes through the flow cell, there is a laser passing through it, and it measures the size. Okay? On the other end, there's going to be so this one, so pag ganun pala, mas maganda. So directly forward yung scatter niya. The sensor is in front of the light source, which is your laser. So forward scatter. That determines the size. How does it determine the size, sir? Well, suppose you have an RBC, and suppose the length of the laser is given as a standard. The amount of laser light being blocked by a particular cell is the thing that determines the cell size. So imaginein mo si Adrian kasing laki ng monocyte. Tapos sino bang kaklase nating maliit dito? Let's say babae na lang para hindi offensive. Baka mamaya makasuhan ako ng libel. Let's say Joanna. Siguro mas maliit si Joanna. I'm assuming, which is a lady. Not being sexist, but I'm assuming. Alright? So si Adrian is almost the size of a monocyte. And when I flash a flashlight to him, in front of him, he will block a certain amount of light. And that will be seen by your classmates as, okay, laki ng shadow ni Adrian. Ngayon, pag dumaan si Joanna, if I pass light in front of her, or the flashlight in front of her, she will create a smaller shadow. So that's what I mean by forward light scatter. Nakita nyo, kayo yung nakakakita, for example, nung size ng cell. Alright? Now, right light scatter determines the type of cell size based on granularity or stain uptake. Now, this one is a little bit difficult for you guys to swallow, so please let me try and help you out here. Light scatter by right angles, or usually it's positioned at 90 degrees, or sometimes it's at 85. Sometimes it's at 100 degrees at 100 degrees in angles. Why do we need to measure the light scatter? Because if the cell has a lot of granules, it will bounce off light to several places. All right? It will bounce off light to several places. Now, if it bounces light off of several places, it means that there's a lot of granules. Okay? Or the stain, it uptook a stain and it bounces light to several locations. So for example, it's like a prism. So for example, in a flow cell cytometer, usually it's used on usually light scatter is used when we try to determine reticulocytosis or reticulocytes. When we stain reticulocytes, they have a lot of ribosomal remnants present. Okay, so they would scatter the light differently as opposed to an RBC. On a similar scale, granules can bounce off light to different locations around the measurement area, and that can be detected or picked up by the sensors positioned at right angles. Okay, so please be mindful of these types of light scatter because you might see them in abbreviations when you look at your results as you go on your practice. So for example, there's a problem with the cell size. The cells cannot be determined, but there's a problem with there's a problem with the histogram for forward light scatter. Okay, you know for a fact that when it comes to forward light scatter, the problem is about the cell size. So you look at the histogram associated to cell size. There might be a clot. You can actually deduce what's the problem with the particular results. And I think you have a lot of questionnaires in Shula that if I'm not mistaken, there's a lot of questions related to automated result troubleshooting. Okay? Now, a flow cell is not complete without what you call the hydrodynamic focusing. So it pushes the cells to form a single file as it passes through an aperture. So what do I mean by hydrodynamic focusing? So basically the cells will fall into a funnel. Okay, they will fall into a funnel. What's inside the funnel? Inside that funnel, there will be water or diluent passing through both sides. Why is it important that there will be that there is diluent passing through both sides? Because it wants the cells to focus to form a single file. If they don't fall into a single file, there might be what you call coincidence analysis or coincidence light, or in this case, or in the case of Coulter principle, is what you call coincidence counting. Two cells will be counted as one, and they would be plotted falsely in the histogram, and therefore your results will be erroneous. Okay. Now the data is presented in both scatter plots and histograms. Wow, talaga sir, ang galing-galing naman. Yes. Major manufacturers of automated hematology analyzers are the following: Beckman Coulter, or the Coulter. Right now they have the models. There's a lot of models there, but I think the one that I was using when I was in the Philippines is HX700, which is capable of doing 5-part differential. Okay. Sysmex, I haven't used it. Siemens, no also. The one that I'm using right now is from Abbott. They use gems as their codes. We have Celdine Ruby and Celdine Emerald for Abbott. And I think Abbott for me is the best when it comes to user friendliness, because all you need to do is just put you just need to change the reagents, do daily maintenance, and the quality control and quality assurance scheme is extremely user friendly. Beckman Coulter, you have to at least have been trained for several weeks to be much more sort of comfortable in using the test or using the machine. All right. Sysmex, what I like about Sysmex from what I've seen in some of the conventions that I've attended here in the Gulf is that in Gulf countries is that they are capable of creating you can program Sysmex with a built-in slide maker. Okay, so the cells it can be built as a CBC analyzer only, or it can be built in with you can purchase also, or the company can also purchase the slide maker module, and that's what I like about Sysmex. Now let's talk about hemoglobin analysis in automation. Basically, it uses the same principles that we mentioned earlier, cyan-methemoglobin or hemoglobin, which measures it at 540 nanometers, which is the gold standard wavelength. Please don't forget that one. Okay? And sodium lauryl sulfate can also be used as a reagent. Or sorry, is the reagent rather. So cyan-methemoglobin, we want to create cyan-methemoglobin. Okay? That's why you will receive in these three manufacturers, in these four manufacturers, they always have the same reagent sets. The daily reagent sets that you need to change. The diluent, the WBC lysing agent, and of course the hemoglobin agent or the hemoglobin lysing agent. Why? Because it is capable of doing hemoglobin analysis. Now, everything else is calculated except for, as I mentioned before, RBC, WBC, and platelets. Hemoglobin, sorry. So, madami siyang platelets pala, 4 pala, hindi pala 5 lang. Alright? Machines are capable of measuring except for RBC indices. Hematocrit is also is also calculated pala. So rule of 3. Okay? Rule of 3 lang siya. So you might receive a result with a threshold limit of beyond the norm, beyond the linearity. Again, the linearity is the capacity of a machine to measure at a specific threshold. So for example, kung 6 lang ang linearity, ang upper limit linearity ng machine mo, pag 7 ang WBC count mo, 6 lang ang linearity, i-release ng machine by programming na greater than, and you have to dilute the sample, and you have to do computations manually. All right? And we do this not all the time, probably once or twice a week, depending on the workload and depending on the cases of the patients that we receive. Especially when patients have polycythemia or polycythemia vera, we have to manually compute the RBC indices. So it is important for you guys to remember your RBC indices even as you are even as you go into the practice, even as you're using automated analyzers. Now there are several specimen handling types. Front-end loading is when you are the one when you're the one feeding the samples. Walk away is another feature. This is the time when you put it on cassettes. So you will have like a cassette, and you need to put in the reagents, the samples in one cassette or one rack, and then you just put it in the machine. The machine will be the one to process it for you. Okay? Now, specific machine principle. For Beckman-Coulter, it's been known to do electrical impedance. Up till now, there's a lot of controversy in the biomedical field about electrical impedance and its importance in clinical laboratory science. But obviously, it's still acceptable because it's still being done in a lot of hospitals around the world. Usually, it will run the sample twice. That's why it's longer. First run the first run measures RBC and platelets. It will not be diluted, but it will be filtered out just to prevent the entrance just to prevent the entry of WBCs in the sample. Okay? The second run is where the WBC diluting fluid is added. Now this one will lyse RBC so that hemoglobin can be directly measured as well as the WBCs. Okay? So, bakit kailangan bigyan ng WBC diluting fluid? Because we want to measure the WBCs solely. Okay? Alright? And that's why it has two sample runs. A first one, undiluted run, a filtered run. The second one is the diluted run with the WBC diluting fluid so that the machine can measure the WBCs and hemoglobin directly. Alright? Now, what about for retics and RBCs? Well, basically, it will measure the volume conductivity of the light and scatter. Alright? This is what you call VCS. Volume conductivity and scatter. WBCs can be corrected if detected in a run. Okay, so if you have NRBCs, it's easily correctable. Alright? It can be corrected by the machine itself, especially if it has a feature of what you call volume conductivity and scatter. Alright? RBC indices are based off of hemoglobin and RBC counts, obviously. Alright? Now, we go on to the XN series of Sysmex. It's basically the same principle, but with some added advantages. Some models prepare slides in conjunction to abnormal samples that were analyzed. Mali ang spelling. That were analyzed. Okay? Now, it can also be used on body fluid analysis. Okay? That's one of the advantages of Sysmex. It's capable of doing a 6-part differential. And again, I'm mentioning only the XN series. Alright? 6-part differential. So, ano yun? Bakit may 6-part? Akala ko hanggang 5 parts lang. Because the 6th part is the immature granulocyte population. It's measuring the immature granulocyte populations. Okay? So, doon na papasok sila mga, si band cells natin. Magpa-flag na siya na, oy, may band cell na nakita. Okay? So, retics and reticulocyte hemoglobin can also be detected. Clinically, it's not really important for us to determine the reticulocyte hemoglobin content. I mean, it's not going to be asked in your exam, so I didn't elaborate this one further. But again, that's what they're flexing about this machine. Okay? Next, it is capable of detecting NRBCs and do corrections when detected, similar to Beckman-Coulter's premier machines or analyzers, and the only automated analyzer that uses sodium lauryl sulfate for hemoglobin analysis. All right, for determining the hemoglobin determining the hemoglobin levels rather. Okay, so next is we have the Celldyne series from Abbott. Abbott has, again, it's based on precious gems because they consider the according to Abbott Laboratories, they consider this as their precious hematology analyzer series. So the latest is of course Sapphire. The latest among them. Sapphire is the most latest, and everything or all of them rely on optical scatter or flow cytometry principle. It relies on MAPS. What is it? MAPS technology, you say? MAPS is multi-angle polarized scatter separation. Basically, that's used for WBC differentials, and it's much more accurate for WBC differentials. All right. It's not like the other ones where you need to do we need to lyse the RBCs? Yes, we need to lyse them also. Okay? What is fun about this machine is that it measures again all of them separately, and it can provide the WBC differentials in only one run. Okay? Why? Because there's multi-angular polarized scatter separation. Okay? Now, Siemens has what they have. They have the Advias series. Again, it's flow cytometry. One of the things that they like about this one is that there is a hemoglobin variation. Okay? It's capable of detecting whether there is hyperchromia or hypochromia. It's going to flag. Sample analyzed is patient analyzed is suffering from hypochromic monocytic hypochromic conditions, which is not seen in the other analyzers. Okay. It can perform cytochemistry like the peroxidase cytochemistry and the basophilic basophilic channels. There's a specific channel for peroxidase positive cells. Okay. And it's capable of cluster analysis. What is that useful for? Cluster analysis is useful when differentiating NRBCs from platelet counts. Okay, because they have the same forward light scatter, which is difficult, which is not a feature of Abbott systems as of their latest machines. Okay, basophil analysis is another thing that is important in the Advia series. But again, basophilic analysis, we can do that in the manually, right? We can just do a smear. But it is a feature that is available for this series of machines. All right. Now, automated reticulocyte counting. Basically, again, they're counted via optical scatter or fluorescence technology. They can it is done by reticulocyte. The computation is done by the machines as a calculated value. The only thing that is measured is the actual retics. All right, and it can also do immature reticulocyte function. So it measures the fluorescence. All right. Stress-related reticulocytosis is oftentimes the cause of the importance of IRF or immature reticulocyte function tests. But again, it's not really that important for us because clinically speaking, it's not going to be on the clinical standpoint. There's not a lot of data to support whether or not the immature reticulocyte function could be a feature that is important in routine hematology or even in special hematology procedures. But if physicians wants these types of results, they can opt to bid for machines that does have these types of features. Another one is reticulocyte hemoglobin content, or CHR. It's important as an iron marker for certain anomalous states such as those who are suffering from renal failure and oncologic patients. Okay? Now, let's talk about one of the final things that about tests. There are certain limitations for automation. Calibration is electronically done, okay, by the instrument to avoid analytical bias. Okay, so everything that you're going to get from the result is objective, as opposed to looking at a smear. It's more or less subjective sometimes. So CLIA guidelines are according to Clinical Laboratory International guidelines. It's periodical. It should be done periodically. Calibrations. Okay, that's the reason why some machines, they would have a sticker. They would have preventive maintenance procedure. All right. It includes calibration also. Okay. Limitations of calibrators. It requires commercially prepared analytes. Okay. And it must be compared to a reference method. It should not be just everything that you do in the laboratory needs to be done by a third party. Needs to be confirmed by another third party calibration process. Okay, so if you want to work in a laboratory who is accredited, you are going to see a lot of paperworks. In the Philippines, calibrations are done by the manufacturers, but here in the country that I'm working in, we usually do the calibrations ourselves, and then a third party agency will do they call it, external calibration checks, and they would have sealed, signed, stamped, and delivered based on CLIA guidelines. All right. So they use a commercially prepared analyte to check if the calibrations are okay, and the results are compared from the results. They compare the results to a reference method. Okay. Next, instrument limitations, commonly brought about by interferences in data, which limits the cell's detection reliability. So what do you mean by those things? There's one thing that you need to remember: specimen limitations, cold agglutinins, okay, age of the patient, disease states, and improper specimen handling. These are considered as specimen limitations. You as medical technologists need to know that there are some cases where there would be spontaneous clotting, even if you mix the sample. So you need, in cases of cold agglutinins, this will falsely decrease platelet counts, okay, and RBC counts. Okay, so when you look at the scattergram, low platelet counts, but there is a normal size. There's a normal size distribution of the cells. There's something wrong with that one. And then when you look at the RBCs, it's also markedly decreased, but there is no but there is a flat line. It's not a bell graph. When you look at it in the histogram, that's the time you're going to suspect that there might be either a cold agglutination or the specimen that was run was clotted. Okay? So be mindful of these limitations. Okay? So the limitations must be handled differently based on the manufacturer guidelines and national guidelines. Of course, you will not be able to operate the machines unless you have been trained. So each analyzer has its own limitations, and you must be and one of the things that they're going to ask you when you're going to be interviewed for a position in hematology is, what machines have you operated in? So, what machines do you use for CBC analysis? They're going to ask that to you. I've been working for almost 10 years now in different laboratories, and most of the time they would ask us what machines have I been using. And luckily for me, I was able to experience 3 out of 4 of the machines that they use here in hematology. Right now, I'm so tired of Celdine Ruby, and I wish I could experience the Advia series, because that's the only thing that I haven't experienced yet. Okay, so that is all of the discussions that we're going to tackle on when it comes to laboratory automation. You have any questions for me before we move on to the next topic? Anybody, you can ask me questions. It's a free forum for you guys. If you don't have any if you have questions, I'm going to leave a timer on the screen. Just 2 minutes. I need a glass of water. Okay, hang on a sec. So 2 minutes on the clock. You can type in your answers. I'll answer it briefly later on. But we also must move on to our next topic, which is anemias. Okay, I think it's time for me to lecture you guys on anemia. Okay, I think it's time. But yeah, this is the same lecture that I gave last year to ayan, nagpakita si Rachel Tesoro. Do you have any questions for me? Nakita ko siya kasi sa camera. Akala ko meron kang question. Ikaw naman, na-excite pa naman ako. Akala ko may question.
Nandito po kasi ako sa warehouse namin.
Ano ba yan? Ano ba yan? Excited pa naman ako. Alright. Thank you so much for showing me your face, Rachel Tesoro. Alright. So, I'll give you guys 2 minutes before we continue, and then I'm going to stop the live stream. Adrian, please remind me to open the live stream when we talk about hematology.